and a certified spiritual care chaplain. He has a history of over 15 years in frontline, middle, and senior management roles in acute, community, and mental health care. He has taught as an adjunct faculty and as sessional lecturers at the University of Toronto, in Emmanuel College, United Church Theological College, and St. Michael's University College, which is the Catholic Federated College of the University. His doctorate considers the origins and future of clinical chaplaincy in mental health care in the context of Catholic-sponsored healthcare. His research focuses on healthcare ethics and mental health, the ethics of clients choosing to live at risk, the meaning of professional ethics in clinical practice, narrative practice as nurses and as healers, spirituality, religion in clinical care, and end-of-life care. That's especially important. Physician-assisted dying, all the issues around this. In the state of Connecticut, no such legislation currently exists, but such legislation exists in about 4 states in the Union. In Canada, it's federal law. So there are all kinds of issues around end-of-life, assisted suicide, issues around the determination of meaning and how people are involved in making decisions about their health care and their future. All these things are on the table, and all of them, of course, will be answered completely by Dr. DeBono. So we're here for 2.5 years. I hope you brought a food package with you, because we're not letting you out until that lecture is over. So please help me welcome Dr. Chris DeBono.
Alrighty, hello everybody. If I'm here for 2.5 years, do I need a visa in the country? Okay. It is really a pleasure to be here tonight. And I titled this talk, Remembering Henri Nouwen, Reclaiming Hospitality and Healthcare. Can I just get a show of hands? How many of you have even heard of Henri Nouwen? Hands up. For about 30% who have heard. So for about 70% of you, you're going to learn a little bit about this guy that was part of my doctoral work and has been an inspiration for people like Dr. Higgins and others. So let me begin with just a couple things. There's a picture of the gentleman. I'd like to talk about things to declare, my context and my core message. And to start, I just want to say in full disclosure that the man you saw welcoming me was on my doctoral defense. May you all be so lucky. I'm also just going to make some reference to some work, and you can also Google this on your own, but that CDC Ideas on the bottom left of the screen is a 3-hour series on Henri Nouwen, and Dr. Higgins and Kevin Burns were the producers and narrators of that, and that's how we connected. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the books that have emerged from that project. So what you need to know from me, I speak with 3 hats. I'm trained as a chaplain, as a pastoral care person at the front end of clinical work, but I'm also a practical theologian. My doctoral work looked at the intersection of mental health and spirituality, and you'll see why that is important today for Nouwen and this other guy we'll talk about. And I assist in terms of clinical and organizational ethics. So that's when people are trying to make very difficult decisions about what the best or the right thing to do. And for those of you that are in nursing and in nursing leadership, you'll know that that is not an uncommon issue for some of the people that you're either training with already or that you will serve when you're out in the community. And in my current role, I'm very humbled to be the Vice President for Mission, Ethics, and Spirituality at this place. And since some of you are about to graduate, this is an unabashed invitation to move to Canada to work for us. We have a great vision statement driven by compassion and social justice. We are at the forefront of exceptional care and innovation. And our tagline is how you want to be treated. Wouldn't you want to come and work for us? Okay, enough about getting employees. But I thought it'd be fun to start with a Rolling Stone cover. You know we don't have a president, we have a prime minister, and he looks like that. And the tagline is, why can't he be your president? Where am I coming from? I'm coming from Vancouver, as I mentioned. It's a good 3,000 miles from you guys. I'm on the other side of America, and pretty close to the border near Seattle. Since I'm going to talk about healthcare, I just want to situate the context that we work in. When I use the word Medicare, that refers to Canada's publicly funded health system. Canada doesn't have a single national plan for how that's rolled out, but each of our provinces, which are kind of like your states, our provinces and territories, we have 13 of them, manage the publicly funded healthcare system. So in this system, all Canadian residents have reasonable access to medically necessary hospital and physician services without paying out of pocket. Of course, there are extra insurance. This is an important part. Both secular healthcare organizations and the ones like the one that I work at called Providence, which is a faith-based Catholic system. But I make a little joke about my visa, partly because I just also want to say that today's talk, even though I'm linking these two ideas and talking about healthcare, is not to focus on current issues in U.S. politics, which I'm hearing a fair bit about when I read the news in Canada about Obamacare. So I want to just situate this about the encounter in healthcare, which I hope will be helpful for your professional careers. And I'm going to share about a guy named Henri Nouwen, but especially his early life. So for the 30% of you that have heard about him, you'll see that often we talk about the much later Henri Nouwen. I want to look at how he started, like you, in a school, learning about what it is to have a clinical engagement with people. So I want you, if I can, ask you to think about the space needed to be hospitable in the work that you will do and that some of you already do. And this lecture ends with a video from Providence, so you'll all want to come and work for us. Okay. The key message is that Henri Nouwen, from the years about 1964 to 77, suggests that hospitality is at the core of health. So maybe that's why hospitals have that word in their name. And the hospitality that Nouwen talks about is a response to loneliness. And I'll tell you why that was important to him. It's a response that'll make you and me feel welcome so that you can arrive with whatever wound you're carrying. And remember, wounds are kind of like the initial criteria to get into a health setting. But also the wounds that all of us carry when we're incredibly distressed. And again, for those of you that have done your practicums, how many of you have met a distressed patient? Only 5?
Really? What kind of a placement program is going on here?
So again, how many of you have met distressed patients? Okay, good. So, and in truth be told, all of us, at one point or another, present as distressed. And the guy that I'm going to talk about knows something about that. And my argument's going to be that if you start with loneliness and understand what it might mean, and you can agree or disagree with Nouwen on that, it can open up a way for you and for me to create the space for someone to feel safe enough to find their healing with you. So I'm going to use clinical issues and anecdotes, and I'm going to talk about Nouwen. So, for the 30% of you in here, whenever I give a talk about Nouwen, there are 3 kinds of things to think about. There are people that don't like this guy, his skeptics. And there are people that think he's just amazing. And then I'm going to tell you my approach for how to understand him, as I would suggest. And if you come to the previous lectures on Nouwen, you'll know that some of this field work has been done by none other than Dr. Higgins, who wrote, not 4 years ago or so, that Nouwen could be sentimentally mushy. You want this guy describing you, eh? Cloying, even crushingly needy. But he was also measured and penetratingly observant, immediately accessible, and even on occasion, positively luminous like the mystics. So you got this Nouwen, and you got another Nouwen. Dr. Higgins continues that this fellow is difficult to place in academia, and here we are in an academic center. Theologians, so people like me that are trained to think about the presence or absence of God in the world, Catholic intellectuals, academics, psychologists, all have difficulty categorizing Nouwen because he had various vocations in his life. So Nouwen would see himself not as a teacher, saw himself as a teacher and a preacher, not as somebody only involved in theory or professional academia. Oof. This will be a bit of better night. You can take a little break. But most importantly, what I hope you'll understand from Nouwen is something I hope you can do in your own lives, which is find a way to connect and always advocate that your encounter with a human person is real and respects their identity. Because Nouwen saw himself as a pastor, a wounded person who continuously searched for how best to be the priest that he was, the pastor that he was, in his life's work. And I would argue, especially for people like me that wear a mission hat, the question of faith identity in the world is not an unimportant one. Because some of the old models are no longer working, and there are new questions that emerge, especially in healthcare, as to how to be humanly present to a vulnerable person who presents as a distressed person in front of you. So I write here that Nouwen had concerns about threats of professionalization. It wasn't that he was against people having skills, but he wanted to make sure that when you use your skills, you use them in a way that maximizes and understands the dignity of the person in front of you. So the lens I want to propose for us is to think about Nouwen through his self-avowed woundedness. So you're going to learn from me that he talked an awful lot about himself. Sometimes that's okay, right? He also was fascinated with the wounded part of himself and thought that somehow loneliness can be a gateway to understand something even more important, which is how we engage people that are suffering. And like you, when he was in his training, he met people and studied people who changed the way he was in his life. Let me just check that. Has that happened to you yet in your life? Have you, hands up if you've met someone who's radically changed the way you approach your life. I hope this has happened. Okay, about 70% of us. May happen on your way out today. Okay. So let's spend a little bit of time with Nouwen. And I want to start by what one biographer, an early biographer of Henri Nouwen, wrote. He wrote a book called The Wounded Prophet. So here you have a priest psychologist. And he said that Henri Nouwen is a wounded prophet for our time. This is the work of Michael Ford from 1999. He was the first person to put those words together in a biography about him because he thought, at one level, that woundedness is all over Henri Nouwen's life, but the prophetic part needed to be called out because what is a prophet? So we're in a Catholic college. We do something related to thinking about the role of faith in our world. Well, in our own tradition, in the Jewish tradition, a prophet is somebody who can be sent to foretell events. But more importantly, a prophet is a spokesperson or an advocate to identify something that you may forget, something that is really important. And what Nouwen did is help us think about how does the human person and the divine person relate together. He thought about this in terms of ministry, and he also thought about this in terms of clinical care. So according to Michael Ford, Nouwen is a guy who often wrote about his own wounds, and those wounds were alienation, separation, isolation, and loneliness. These are the ones that he shared in his own life. So here's a question. Would you want to hang out with this guy? A lot of people wanted to hang out with this guy because he had a very unique way to communicate the kind of existential angst that some of us, and I won't get you to raise your hands for this one, can feel at different points in our life. But it gets a little more complicated because one of Henri Nouwen's other issues in his life was the issue of sexuality. So in a few moments I'll tell you about some archival work that I discovered that shows that one of his earliest papers he wrote in 1963 and 64 was on homosexuality. And we learned later in Henri Nouwen's life that this is something that he struggled with. And in one of his works, his first published book in 1969, there's this little line that emerges, and it's been picked up by this author. It's a fun little book to read about Henri Nouwen called His Life and His Spirit by Kevin Burns. That Henri Nouwen writes in this book on intimacy that through Jesus we are invited to understand the homosexual existence as an expression of our basic human condition. And look at the words that emerge again, which is one of fear, anxiety, loneliness, homelessness. And in essence, these feelings that are of wounds are a cry for the liberating power of faith, hope, and love. What's neat about studying somebody so deeply is you realize that for some people, the questions that they're asking are questions they carry through their whole life. And that's one of the points that Kevin Burns makes in his book. I'll come back to the woundedness of Henri in a moment. But another really important Canadian, Jean Vanier, who founded a community called L'Arche, was a mentor of Henri Nouwen as well. And he actually preached at Henri Nouwen's funeral in 1996. And he said that our anguish, the anguish of someone like Henri Nouwen, can be a wound, and that wound can be a source of genius and light for others. Now, I'm hoping this kind of rubs you a little bit odd. How can a wound, how can something that really troubles me be a source of genius and light for others? In a few moments, I'm going to tell you how Nouwen lived this, but he also studied someone where he saw the same thing in that person. So let's talk a little bit about Henri's needs in 3 ways. Never get your brother to quote you when they're talking to a journalist or a media person, because his brother said, you know, Henri did sometimes ask for too much. None of you have ever done that, right? Ever asked for a grade to be reassigned? Okay. The other thing to know about this guy is that he would speak to audiences of hundreds and at times thousands of people. He had an incredible charisma. That's him teaching a course. He had an incredible ability to communicate on things of deep emotion and need. And people loved him. Right up to those things. But interestingly, there are stories where Henri Nouwen would give this kind of a talk, and then he would go to the room, a hotel room, he'd travel across the world to do this sort of stuff. And somehow, what he would feel is that he felt like crying because he was deeply lonely. Does that make sense to you as an experience? And even earlier in his life, he asked his mom and his dad, back in Holland, and I'll show you where he's from in a moment, do you love me? Repeatedly, he asked the question, do you love me? And for the 30% in the room who know, one of the things he often wrote about is how lovable you are by God. So we've got this little bit of a paradox. So let's drill down the paradox a little bit further. Because when he came to the United States to study at a place called the Menninger Center, he moved out in 1965 to take a little trip and go and visit a really, really important person, a psychiatrist and a monk by the name of John Bamberger. And he went to see him for some really important conversation about his own needs. So first of all, Henri Nouwen normalizes that sometimes it's really good to talk to people when we're feeling this inner turmoil. That's an important clinical skill when we're with people that are in healthcare and that we're caring for them. But what John saw in him was that he had this big paradox in his life. He wanted to be extremely popular. And he also had this deep need that he always had to be reassured that you're lovable. So you might want to think about that, partly that it always has to be reaffirmed, reaffirmed, reaffirmed. So that can be a bit of an odd dynamic to live with. And what Bamberger encouraged him to do is to work on that, to get a little more insight. And it raises a really interesting question. When your mental models of who you are and how you are in the world create such anguish for you, how do you possibly find healing? What can you do, and what does Nouwen teach us, as we'll talk, when you feel like you're stuck in a tension that never goes away? So today, I want to talk about situating the kinds of people you will meet by using Henri Nouwen. Because I'm afraid, and I work in a healthcare system, that when you read about healthcare across our 2 countries and beyond, it's quite possible that some of the experiences people are having in healthcare is one of hostility, a sense that it's unfriendly, it's unkind. There's kind of enmity between people. Well, now we had this profound insight that you and I can be in places of hostility, and he talked about this in terms of our spiritual life, but that the goal is to move to a place of deep hospitality, where you are my friend, I am kind to you, and a little bit like the Good Samaritan, I recognize in you a neighbor. So let me push this a little bit harder. Just for fun, I want to talk about a foolish idea of how fiscal realities can make healthcare look a little crazy. And then I want to talk a little more deeply about how we can miss elements in care, in this case spirituality, and how we can sometimes see people as fragmented. So as I was preparing this talk, I was reading the news, and can you imagine having your loved one in a nursing home where they were told to ration toilet paper? That's not a joke, honestly. You know what some of the family members said? They said, if they're rationing toilet paper, what else are they not doing? Right? But more importantly, one of my earliest clinical encounters when I worked in a forensic psychiatric center, a little bit north of Toronto in Ontario, and I met a patient who had been in that center for over 25 years. So forensic patients are people who have committed criminal acts for which they're not responsible on account of their mental health issues. And I was really keen, just like Henri was, to understand how people think about their spiritual lives in healthcare. And I asked this guy about it, and this is what he told me. In my experience, talking about this, talking about God, only leads to one thing: more medication. And I have to admit, it really made me stop. Because here I was in a premier psychiatric facility where someone realized that the only way we thought about the spiritual life was what is often called pathological turns. Now, it is true, in a major psychiatric facility, there will be pathology about religion and spirituality. But in this guy's case, nobody had ever suggested that it was possible, on the one hand, to live with a mental health issue, and on the other, to have a meaningful spiritual life. So we did some work together, and one of the outcomes was that some of the staff said, oh my God, let's call him Christopher. If Christopher can have a spiritual life, then maybe I can too. So I just want to remind you that as you work in these areas, we need to understand, obviously, where there is unhealth and where there is pathology, where that needs healing. But we need to be very careful when we look at a person to not overly pathologize everything that goes on. The guy who created defibrillators wrote this about concerns about healthcare. The special affinity of trust in medicine is being traded for a new type of relationship. I hope you're on the left side of the column. That healing is replaced with treating, that caring is supplanted by managing, and the art of listening is taken over by technological procedures. And doctors no longer minister to a distinctive person, but concern themselves with fragmented, malfunctioning biologic parts. And a distressed human being, most of us put our hand up of having met one or two, is frequently absent in the transaction. So I'm always intrigued that when people create technology, they can be very sensitive to the fact that, of course, that's important and it treats a part of the body. But we need to remember that there's a whole person present. Let me tell you a story about a system that encountered a distressed person. And this is a true story. An elderly woman is the substitute decision maker for her husband, who is in grave respiratory distress, has multiple comorbid conditions, and is surviving, really being kept alive, only with full venting. The healthcare professionals propose palliative care and the withdrawal of life support. And the couple's children agree with this plan. And we joke in healthcare, one flew in from California and the other one flew in from Ottawa, right? But the substitute decision maker, the wife, can only talk about prom night. And she says she's unable to consent to the plan, and this goes on for days. So, again, for those of you that have already had your placements on floors, the team is at its end. They keep talking to her. It can cost a lot of money to keep somebody in ICU, can it? We would never, of course, do that in a professional practice. But we're aware that the plan seems to be clear. This person, really, let's recommend the appropriate clinical plan, which is good comfort measures. So they're really, really frustrated with the substance decision maker, the wife, and they think, my God, she's so stuck in the past that maybe she's unable to consent. So in a healthcare setting, when a person is unable to give capably their own consent, there's a substance decision maker who can do that on their behalf, not as they would want, but as the person would want according to their values and wishes. But in this case, the team is stuck because technically the wife is the designated substance decision maker in this case. So they're about to just bypass her. And somebody has the idea, she's a distressed human being, why don't we try and find someone who can talk to her really about it? Because some people had tried, but they stopped when she said, I can only talk about prom night. Now, you're all clinicians in the making. You're all people that are concerned about other people. The key question that needs to be engaged here, that a chaplain did this, is to sit down with such a decision maker and say, tell me about prom night. So she started the story. We were 17. We were finishing high school. We were a little town. They played that favorite song of the last night, the last part of the dance. And I looked at him, and he looked at me. And we both knew that this was the beginning of the rest of our lives. And we said to each other, I will love you all the days of my life. I will love you all the days of my life. What are you thinking now? You're all clinicians in the making. Why can't she say yes to withdrawal of life support? I will love you all the days of your life. So the really good healthcare listener picked up that for her, the dissonance was that if we withdraw life support, I cannot love you all the days of my life. Does that make sense to you? Okay. There was a major breakthrough first that we found out what the problem was. It wasn't just that I could only talk about prom night. It was that I cannot imagine my life breaking the promise I made to you. So it's some really important work, and it's the kind of thing Henri Nouwen was capable of doing as well. The staff person encouraged you to think about, is there another way to interpret that event? First of all, what would your husband want? And I'll tell you where the ending went. Is she realized that I can love you all the days of your living and all the days of your dying too. And she needed that interaction that embraced her being distressed and didn't pathologize it to help move the conversation forward. That makes sense to you as a story? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this Henri guy again and why distressed human beings were important. So I've told you that he knew something about people being distressed. And he spent a lot of time studying one such person. How do I know about that? Well, I was doing my doctoral work and I was interested in clinical chaplaincy and mental health and all that stuff. And I happened to be in a library one day at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, where Dr. Higgins was saying that I finished my work. And I went to look for this book, and I found out that not only were there a lot of really cool things about Henri Nouwen, which I kind of knew, that's why I was in the library, but there was actually an archive that had the work that Henri Nouwen was doing when he tried to study this fellow named Anton Boysen. So just to give you a sense, there's literally about 3 feet of linear files of the work that Henri Nouwen did to study Anton Boysen. I was writing about Anton Boysen. So I thought, this is a treasure trove. No one else, can't tell anyone about it. I'm going to dig down. And I did. So I studied the material, I collated it, I developed it further. And I discovered a couple of really important things. Is Nouwen, who's like really, really smart, tried to write his doctoral dissertation on Anton poison and failed. Didn't get it. That's not a good sign, when you're trying to get your own doctorate. But there were reasons for that. And in the process, I also realized that this key offers a really important way to understand someone. So remember, I asked you if somebody has changed your life. That can happen through love, that can happen through friendship, that can also happen through study. And Boysen was a guy that Nouwen was trying to study a little bit when he was in, he did study him when he was in Holland, but he really, really studied him a fair bit when he was in the US. And I want to talk about that connection because Boysen is important to him, but then there's this irony. You can almost not find him in his published writings. But there are some critical clues, and I want to talk about those. So I call this the invisible but the critical Boysen, and we're going to see where he shows up. But first, let me tell you now a little bit about Henri Nouwen and how he gets here to your country. Most people are familiar with Henri Nouwen, not in the circle that I've written about, the Men Center, Topeka, USA. Of course, he taught at the great schools. Dr. Higgins mentioned that. After Notre Dame for 2 years, he was at Yale, he was at Harvard. Okay. He also spent the last 10 years of his life at March. So he comes from that small little country where the arrow is, and he spends most of his life, this Dutch man, either in America, most of him's here, and in Canada. This man never had an unpublished thought. Those are all the books he wrote. Almost as many as Dr. Higgins. Okay? But the circle I'm drawing is the early circle. And this is where this relationship with Anton Boysen shows up. He wrote 2 articles about Anton Boysen, and not all of them even show up in a lot of the official biographies. In 1968, he wrote Anton Boysen in Theology Through Living Human Documents. And then there are references in 3 books and an image in another. And I'm going to walk through that and just show you why this might be an interesting guy who's thinking about loneliness. In Intimacy, which he writes in 1969, his question is, how can I find a creative and fulfilling intimacy in my relationship with God and my fellow man and or woman? The context is he's working at Notre Dame and he spends a time with a group of priests that are doing campus ministry. And he hears this question about how to be with people in that complex time. And he says, you know what, that struggle isn't just with one age group. It's not just with young people on a campus like you folks. But the struggle of every modern man or woman beyond the borders of a university campus. He goes a little bit deeper. He says, I want to look at that question as a pastor. That is, somebody who is concerned and wonders how to understand what he or she sees in light of God's work with men and women. And then he goes a little bit deeper, and this is where this link to Anton Boysen comes. He says, are there people doing this kind of work that realize that every day the source for theological, spiritual reflection is right in front of you? And referencing his Christian theology, he says, since God became human, humans have become the main source for the understanding of God. So just as the parish is as much a field hospital or field research for priests as the hospital is for the doctor. So he wanted to say that when you look at people, you might find what this Protestant mental health chaplain Anton Boysen said when he wrote this. No historian worthy of the name is content to accept on authority the simplified statement of some other writer, some other historian, regarding the problem that is in front of us. So, says Anton Boysen, I have sought to begin not with ready-made formulations or conclusions contained in books, but with actual living human documents that have actual social conditions that are complex. So remember this whole piece about fragmenting healthcare? Boysen is suggesting that you got to read the books. Trust me, if you're going to get your degrees, read the books. But you you just have to remember that there's a person in front of you that has their own story, a story to tell, and a story with social complexity. And Nouwen takes this insight about how people's lives show up, and he looks around him at people that are being trained, and he says, we can be very, very unskilled if we only use our professional hat in the way we greet people. The tension in one of his other books in 1971 is that psychosocial skills are helpful, but you need to get into the dynamics of what are going on with the person in front of you. And in 1977, the last reference we've got, he talks about Anton Boysen when he talks about you and me being a reminder that healing is possible. A reminder that something that's going on clinically can have a spiritual aspect too. And that is why Boysen proposed a theology through living human documents. So, okay, let's backtrack a little. Who is this Boysen fellow, and how did Nouwen even get there? Well, you need to go from your little town in Connecticut to a place called Topeka, Kansas. Because in 1964, Henry gets off a boat and heads here. He heads here to work and learn from the Menninger Center, and that's where he does his deep work on Anton Boysen. The Menninger Center has since moved, but in its day it existed in Topeka, Kansas. That's a picture of the campus on the top right. And this may seem common for us, but in the day, this was America's first group psychiatry practice. And it was revolutionary because it believed, free medicine, and I think you believe this as well, that we can have a better kind of medicine and a better kind of world. And they believed that people dependent not on the other, but upon God. I hope by now part of the insight that's developing is, remember, now he starts by writing about intimacy, and when he writes about it, he refers to this guy, because that's the same story. And it wasn't just enough for Nouwen to read about Boysen, he actually went to see him. And when he went to see him, this is what he wrote. When I left, I was very thankful that I had the opportunity to meet this man whose suffering had become a source of creativity. He's talking about Boysen's struggle. The condition in which I found him clearly showed that his basic suffering had never completely left him. And for 2 years, he had more psychosis, and he lives instead on the borderline of reality. And then when he became tired, he became psychotic. Fear of nuclear war, his many death thoughts, his never completely solved love affair with Alice. And he idolized her who only wanted to be left alone, and he still suffers from these puritanical fears. But here comes a very interesting observation about woundedness. Seeing a man so closely and being able to experience how a deep wound can become a source of beauty, in which even the weaknesses seem to give light, is a reason for thankfulness. Now, this can be a bit of a challenging concept to think about, of how a wound can be beautiful. Really, we see wounds and we try and fix them, don't we? And when we can't fix them, we relieve the suffering they cause. But he saw in this man an opening to something very important, which is, what do we do with people that have deep wounds of loneliness? And for those of that have read Henri Nouwen, you might remember that this line, I put the picture of the Grand Canyon here, shows up in a book called The Wounded Healer. And that's the quote on the right. In The Wounded Healer, Henri Nouwen tries to understand how you and I can be therapeutic with people, but we don't always have it all together, right? I won't ask you to put your hand up if you have it all together. But Nouwen was thinking about when we help people, a wound can actually be, the quote here, is an incision in the surface of our existence which becomes an inexhaustible source of beauty and self-understanding. And interestingly, there's a linguistic connection between the work he wrote in 1964. And then when he has a mental health breakdown in 1996, he suggests that the wound of loneliness can be a way to intimacy with God. In a minute or two, I want to share this video, but what I want you to think about around loneliness is this idea that emerges in his work, that perhaps when you and I are lonely, that's an invitation for us not to turn inwards only, but to recognize that it's an invitation to transcend the limitations we have and look beyond the boundaries of our existence. But loneliness reminds us that we need to move beyond the limitations of our own existence and look outside. And this is where I want to end by showing you how some of our staff took someone who was particularly isolated in their healing story and found a way to create a safe place for that voice to be heard. Because Nouwen argues that you and I can do that in our clinical work, and we can do that in our lives by making space for another person. So let me show you this video, and then we'll wrap up with a few reflections. The video is about 8 minutes.
This is a story of a team getting together and finding unconventional ways of having a patient speak. Here, when I met him was in 2011. He was 19. He was living in a refugee camp in Nepal with his family as a mum and dad and a younger sister. 2 years ago, before I met him, Henri was in a motor vehicle accident. He was riding his motorbike with his friend and they crashed. They both weren't wearing helmets. His friend was fine, but Henri wasn't. He suffered a fairly significant traumatic brain injury.
The family had done an amazing job taking care of him independently in the camp. He was at home, they were taking care of all his basic needs. He had equipment like a nasogastric tube that had been in place for a very long time and was working perfectly. When you stood back and looked at the care the family had been delivering, you couldn't not be amazed.
He was sponsored by the Canadian government, his entire family, to come over to Canada. On the flight over, it looks like he possibly aspirated, and so by the time they arrived in Vancouver Airport, he was in respiratory distress. He was then sent to St. Paul's Hospital, admitted to the medicine unit for maybe only a couple of hours, and then had to come down to the ICU where we had to intubate him and put him on a breathing machine and provide life support.
He had developed an aspiration pneumonia on the way, which had slid into sepsis. So he was way off his baseline when he got to us.
He also was suffering from a lot of seizures, and they would come on unexpectedly. We would treat him with, the best practice for preventing the seizures and reducing any pain, and they would exhaust him. He would lose consciousness and be almost sleeping for about 2 days, and this would happen back and forth, and we would always keep coming back to the family of, well, is this the right way we want to treat him? Is this the right thing that he would want as well? And for about 2 months, it was just this back and forth with the family.
As far as the family was concerned, this was so new. I don't think he thought was happening in the camp. We were faced with someone who died from this septic episode, and on top of it, he was seizing so much. We never saw what he was like normally, as far as from a neurological standpoint. We always saw someone who was very, very compromised in that fashion. It was hard because we didn't know him, and I think also because the family was struggling with everything else. They had just arrived into a new country. English was their second language. It was hard for them to communicate what he was like when he was at home, and not having the sort of medical problems that he was experiencing in the hospital. His case was anything but normal. 6 months stay in the ICU he was almost here for something like 6 months, is unusual. People either get better or die. From our standpoint, we could see someone who was brain damaged, who was having limited responses to any sort of stimulation, wasn't having a lot of organized behaviors. When you see that over an extended period of time, you start asking yourself, am I doing these people any favors by throwing all this aggressive treatment his way?
However, the family also kept pushing, going, just give him some time, he is in there, let's treat these seizures and then let him wake up and see who he is underneath. Some team members might have felt that it was futile treatment. They still allowed space for more dialogue, more conversation, and allowed us to try different ways of getting Henri to communicate. He was a speech-language pathology who I kind of rallied next to. With Vicky's guidance and expertise in that, we were able to follow her and bring her out.
I think the first consistent sign that Henri was responding to things outside of his own body was the fact that he would make eye contact and track as your movements as you entered the room. He always had a big grin for Sarah, who was his absolute favorite nurse. He'd always tell, because no matter how bad a day he was having, he'd have a smile for Sarah.
I remember this one moment where I walked into the room and said, "Hi Henri, how are you?" And he turned and looked at me and smiled. They caught me because not only did he turn and hold his head and gaze at me, which he wasn't able to do, he recognized me and smiled. And that excited me. I do remember running to Vicky going, he knows who I am. He smiled. Come on, let's get going with this.
Those little glimmers, those little signs are always what we look for in patients like Kira, and any kind of patient with a neurological problem there, because that's the first sign that you're going to be able to work with them to draw them out. Kira had very little control of his muscles, so that was one of our biggest challenges. When somebody can't speak, barely has enough movement to make facial expressions, and barely has the ability to hold up their head in order to know how to shake their head. How do you access what's going on in their heads? And it started out as maybe 6 answers out of 10 he'd answer correctly, just nodding yes or no. And then he got to an 80% level. And then he, out of 4 words on a picture board, he'd be able to pick out with his eyes the correct word that he said.
With Vicky's help, we realized that actually he had fairly great finger and motor control. So Vicky was able to bring in an iPad and he was able to tap out words such as full treatment, no DNAR, I am happy, I love my life, I love my family. And for him to be able to just share that was powerful.
Kira spoke for himself. He showed us what he was capable of. And I think my job was just to make sure that nobody forgot that.
You would ask him to do something, he would do it, you would praise him, and it would just give him even more fight to show not only himself but others that no, I'm here, I'm strong, and I can fight through this.
Okay, start from beginning now. Okay, H-I-R, you know your spelling, right, Emma? Okay.
The main thing is to allow the patients to have a voice in their own treatment.
Don't assume that what you think is in front of you is really what's happening. Give things time, have some patience, and let somebody come through.
I always look for inspiration when I'm here, and I look at different people inspired at different times, different people around me, all of them what we're capable of.
Story of voice found, by the way, for a very exceptionally smart clinical team that found a speech-language pathologist who was able to find a way to hear someone who was unable to speak for himself earlier. It wasn't that he was unable to speak, actually. It was that we were unable to hear the real story, right? I'll come to a minute as I conclude with some of the ethical questions and concerns that this case will raise. But I started anecdotally by telling you the story of a health system that missed that a patient living with intense mental health issues and chronic ones could possibly have had a meaningful spiritual life as well. I told you the story about the prom night and the wife who was so distressed that people couldn't understand the meaning she was making that kept her from really responding to the question until someone sat down with her. We talked about a guy named Henri Nouwen who had deep feelings of loss and loneliness, and who discovered someone who taught him that it's not the end of the world. There are ways to work through that, and it can shine a light. If HERA, and I use this program in our orientation about the mission of our organization. If HERA had woken up, I always ask our staff that we're a Catholic organization and said, I don't want any extraordinary measures. I say, thanks for bringing me out, but I don't want to be intubated at the time that he was. We would have, obviously, as an organization, honored that request of a capable person making a choice. The point of showing this story is not to say that you have to live at any cost. It's to hear the story of the patient who directs the care in an informed way. So let me close with this final story, which reminded me of you just never know who's in the room. Not too long ago, I was sharing this story, as I said, with a new group of employees. And as I got them to break into a little group to say, well, what would you do and what's important about this story? A gentleman came down to me and said, I just want you to know that I now work for Providence Healthcare. And here is my son. And I can only tell you, as a refugee who's finding a new life in a country, that the hospitality your staff showed me taught me that this is what working in healthcare is about. So whether you're inspired by HERA, whether you're inspired by his father, or whether it's that guy that Anton Boysen tried to get his doctorate on and never finished it, you meet people, and you will be people, that can touch people's lives so profoundly that they will remember you all the days of their life. And with that, I say thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about contemporary spirituality in healthcare. So, do we have time for a few questions? Okay. So, class full of people, thinking, training for careers in healthcare. What do you think? Comments, questions, things that this provokes in you? And just like in any setting, there are no silly thoughts or questions. Do they have a thought or a question they want to share?
I think what's particularly interesting about the video you showed is that you can look at that and I gather most of us would have an assumption about this individual's quality of life. The quality of life was poor, and therefore why are we continuing to
Provide care.
provide care? But what's interesting is more and more I'm reading about how patients who are assumed to be brain dead or comatose or completely unresponsive or unaware of their situations, more research is showing that they actually, even people who are presumed to be deeply unconscious, if there is such a word, actually are aware of their environment and can hear things and feel things. So I know one of the things I learned a long time ago was a nurse who was never assumed anything about a patient. I remember working as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for 3 years, and every night on rounds we would go with the patients and make sure they were dry. There was one patient who never said a word for 3 years. Never. And one night I was going in and changing her linens, and all of a sudden she said something. And it just astounded me because I always assumed she couldn't talk, but it's like she really, everything was okay. So, anyway.
So from a clinical perspective, one of the important things to underscore is we never know what somebody's hearing or not hearing. And it's really, really important to be prudent in the way you speak about a patient, with a patient. The other part that you're reminding me about is that we recently are reimagining the way that we help people live in what's called long-term care. So it's a higher level of living in care for persons that are unable to stay in their own homes. And in the midst of moving an environment that kind of looked too much like a hospital, we started creating a space that looked more like a home. and one of our staff was trying to move something and had to get on a ladder or something, and a patient that had not spoken in, again, 3 years said, "This is going to end badly." So you just never know what's going to draw somebody out in the relationships that they're in. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that these stories also remind you of your clinical practice, because that's really, the interface that Henri Nouwen tried to work on and think about. Other thoughts? Did it surprise you? Did any of the themes we talked about surprise you? I understand that somebody gets an A if they ask a question from the learning English program. Okay, just joking.
As something I rarely talk about, but my father dove into a swimming pool when I was 7 years old, 30 years ago, and hit the bottom and broke his neck. And he's quadriplegic to this day, lives with me the whole life. So I'm a family member who has dealt with nursing homes, rehabilitation, hospitals, ICU, many types of gear over the course of 38 years. So what you do is not just for the person that's in the bed, it's the families who you really often are talking to, dealing with. That's just basically it. We're important because we're the ones that often help you make the decisions, help you can really talk to.
Thank you for sharing that story. The Nouwen reason for making the link is that he was all about the personal connection. And the patient in the bed has connections too. The patient in the bed is not alone. So thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts for tonight? I just want to say thank you for your attention tonight. It's been a pleasure to share part of my clinical work and research into this guy. And you can finish your program for nursing and go on and get a master's and change the world. That's what SHU does, doesn't it?
Don't we do? Thank you. Thanks, Dr. DeBono, for spending time with us tonight. And just as we head back now to our residences or whatever for the evening, keep in mind that one of the things that Dr. DeBono generated tonight should percolate with us, and that is that in the best tradition of Catholic thought and spirituality, things cohere. What happens in a clinical setting, what happens in the academy, what happens in our lives is of a piece. And that's in great measure what Sacred Heart University does. One of the things that we do in our classes with you is to find ways to bring things together so that they cohere. They're part of a piece that what the ancients called integritas, integrity, it's unity. We see it tonight when we see academicians studying at pedigree universities trying to make sense of complex issues, but also wrestling with loneliness, the existential reality that in a very real way defines all of us, no matter when we are feeling even the most in. Questions of eternity, questions of healing, questions of threshold moments. They're all part of that larger journey. And what Dr. DeBono has helped do for us in the context of healthcare, in the context of principles of compassion, tenderness, and kindness, and care, is to put this within the context of the personal. And that, believe it or not, is in the end what really the Catholic intellectual tradition is about. Okay, thank you, and good night.